The imperative mood expresses command, entreaty, or exhortation. In other words, it indicates the desire to influence the action of another. Here are some examples of what the imperative mood sounds like in English. Please help. Close the door. Give me that book. Learn Greek. You'll notice that these sound like commands. In English, an imperative expresses a command. The imperative is one of 4 moods in the Greek verbal system. The other 3 are the indicative, the subjunctive, and the optative. Remember, a mood is a feature of the Greek verb that indicates the nature of the verbal action with regard to reality. In other words, mood designates whether the action of the verb is considered actual or only potential. The imperative mood does not express reality, but intention, possibility, or volition. The Greek imperative has a wider range of uses than the English imperative. In addition to its use as a command, the Greek imperative also indicates prohibition and permission. The tense of the verb in the imperative mood does not express the time of the action, that is, past, present, or future time, but the kind of action or aspect. Only the aorist and present tense forms appear in the Greek New Testament. Present tense imperatives indicate a continuous action. The aorist tense imperative indicates an undefined action. An author or speaker may use the imperative mood to express a command. Grammarians call this use the imperative of command. It occurs either in the second person, you, or the third person, he, she, it, they. This sense of the imperative often occurs in the context of someone superior addressing somebody inferior in rank. Here's the visual filter that I put together for looking at Greek imperative verbs. You'll notice I have 2 sets of criteria here. One is those imperatives in the aorist tense, indicated by this red color here, and present tense imperatives indicated by the blue. So let's look at our first example here from Luke 18:22. And in this verse we have a couple of imperatives. These 2 here, sell and distribute, are both in the aorist tense as indicated by the visual filter. And over here at the end we have an imperative in the present tense. And again, just a reminder that in the imperative mood, the tense doesn't refer to the time of the action, but rather the kind or type of action. And you remember that the aorist here indicates an undefined action, or looks at the action of the verb as a whole, without regard to whether it's continuous or whatever. But in certain contexts, especially this one here in Luke 18:22, the aorist can indicate a sense of urgency. What I mean by that is that in this context, this young ruler is commanded to begin an action that he is not yet performing. Now, that isn't just wrapped up in the aorist tense itself. Looking at the context here, Jesus said to him, "One thing you still lack." In other words, there's an action that he's not yet performing, and this aorist tense is used to place urgency on performing or beginning that action. It's the same here with what we have, the verb here, distribute. You may remember, if you've seen the other videos on tense already, that this usage of tense when stressing the beginning of an action is labeled ingressive. And that's what we have here. Down at the end of this verse, we see that there's a command here that's in the present tense. And the present tense, when used with the imperative mood, indicates a continual action. And in this context now, it's evident that the young ruler has yet to follow Jesus. And so this usage of the present tense also has an ingressive focus, in that the young ruler is to begin and continue to follow Jesus. So you can see how the aspect of the Greek tenses here in the imperative mood add definition to the story that we wouldn't otherwise get just by looking at the English. And often this type of definition is difficult to capture in an English Bible translation, but it is something that your audience may benefit from. Now, one last thing. You may have noticed here, right before this last imperative, follow, we have what looks like another imperative here, come. and it seems as though the visual filter didn't pick it up. And I just want to point out that if we select this word, you'll see that underneath the Greek is deuro, and if we hover over this, we can see that it's an adverb in Greek. But in English, that gets translated as though it sounds like an imperative. So if you looked at that and wondered why it wasn't highlighted, well, that's why. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7 is another verse where you can see the value or the difference that Greek tense makes. Here we have this famous saying of Jesus, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you." Now, I don't have the visual filter on, just to illustrate a point here, that in English, reading this, we're not sure if the action is progressive or repeated, or if the action of the verb is a one-time event. But if we turn on our visual filters, imperative verbs, these are highlighted now in blue, indicating the underlying Greek imperatives are in the present tense, which means that the verbal action has an iterative force, meaning that of a repeated action. So, for example, this verse could read, "Keep on asking, and it will be given to you. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and it will be open to you." In fact, this is the kind of translation that the New Living Translation takes. See it down here. Keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be open to you. So you can see that insight as to how the Greek present tense works with the imperative mood explains why the New Living Translation differs from all the other major translations. And as I said before, bringing the force or the sense of the present tense in the imperative mood is a difficult task to accomplish in translation. But you can bring that force out as you teach, and it would be valuable, especially in a passage like this, where just reading it in English, someone can think, well, I asked God for something once, and it wasn't given to me. Here, the idea of the present tense shows that the action should be repeated. A Greek imperative in the present tense can also suggest that an action should become a custom or a habit. And that's what we have here in Philippians chapter 4, verse 1, where Paul commands the Philippians to stand firm. Now, in verse 127, he's already noted that they are standing firm in one spirit. But here, he commands that they should continue to walk in that action. Now, we've already looked at the use of the present tense as ingressive, stressing the beginning of an action, and as iterative, which is stressing a repeated action. Admittedly, it's difficult to determine the sense between something that is customary or habitual and something that is to be a repeated action. Generally, the present tense and the verb that expresses a customary or habitual action will involve something of an attitude or mindset, and it'll also be a verbal action that could be taken as a general command or general principle rather than a specific action. So here's an example of an imperative in the third person, highlighted here by the blue letters. And the third person is usually translated with the words "let him" or "let the one." But sometimes in English that conveys the idea of permission, as though this would be a suggestion that if somebody's going to boast, you can boast in the Lord. But really that sort of idea misses the force of the imperative, that boasting in the Lord isn't one of the options that somebody has. In fact, if you're going to boast, you must boast in the Lord. Instead, it could be understood as the one who boasts must boast in the Lord, instead of let him. Now, when we look at the text comparison, we'll see that most translations have let the one who boasts or let him boast, and we get the sense that there's a command here. The New Living Translation is the one that comes closest to carrying the weight of the imperative into the translation. If you want to boast, boast only in the Lord, which is more of the idea behind the present imperative in the Greek here. Let's take a look at one other example. And here we have another example of the Greek imperative, third person, being translated with the keywords "let him" or "let the one." Now, there's nothing wrong with that translation. You'll see that in the text comparison, quite a few other major translations have that rendering. But a reader or a hearer can think that perhaps James is writing here that if anyone lacks wisdom, God is one option for obtaining wisdom, when that's really not the sense that the biblical authors had behind this imperative. It's more closer to if anyone lacks wisdom, he must ask God, or he should ask God. And so you want to make sure when you quote this scripture, you carry the idea of the imperative into your explanation, that God isn't one option, and that James isn't carrying the idea of just permission, that one now has the permission to ask God. You'll see this sort of difference in translation in the text comparison, where the ESV, NRSV, NASB, and the KJV and NKJV all take the keyword let him or let the one. You'll notice that the NRSV and the NIV and the NLT carry over the force of the imperative a bit more. Here we have, if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God. Down here in the NIV, we have he should ask God. And in the New Living Translation, we have ask our generous God. An author or speaker may also use the imperative mood to forbid an action. Grammarians call this use the imperative of prohibition. Essentially, it's a negative command. It's indicated by the grammatical construction may plus the imperative. This happens almost exclusively with the present tense. English Bible translations may have do not or you must not. Let's take a look at some examples. Here in John chapter 2, verse 16, we have an example of an imperative of prohibition. Here's our imperative in the present tense. And you can see down here the negative particle may. So here we have our negative particle plus the imperative in the present tense. And here's the translation, do not. Some other translations may have must not. This use of the imperative in the present tense commands that an action already in progress cease. And that's what we have here in the wider context. Merchants were already making the temple a place of business, or as it says here in the ESV, a house of trade. Here's another example of an imperative of prohibition. We have our Greek imperative in the present tense, along with the negative particle may, to give a negative command. And in the context, Peter has just been shown different sorts of animals, the reptiles and such, and he's commanded to eat. He refuses to eat because he regards the animals as unclean. And then a voice came to him again, or the same voice came to him again a second time. What God has made clean, do not call common. This imperative of prohibition commands that an action cease that is already in progress. And that's determined by context, because in the preceding verses we saw that Peter was in fact regarding the different animals as unclean. In John chapter 14, verse 1, we have another example of an imperative of prohibition, this time in the third person instead of the second person. Here we have our negative particle, may, and over here is our imperative in the present tense, third person. And as before, this imperative commands that an action cease that is already in progress. And once again, that's a matter of context. Here, the disciples, we know from the preceding chapters, were troubled in heart by Jesus' message that he was going away to a place where they couldn't go. And so Jesus commands them to let their hearts be troubled no longer. An author or speaker may use the imperative mood to make a request in the context of certain social situations. For example, someone inferior in rank may request something from someone superior in rank. Grammarians call this use the imperative of request. English Bible translations handle this in a number of different ways. 1. Translate the imperative as an imperative. 2. Translate the imperative as a question to capture the sense of request. Or 3. Supply please to the imperative to make the nature of request explicit. John chapter 4, verse 7 is an example of an imperative used for a request. In this context, Jesus meets a woman at the well and says to her, give me a drink. Now, if we had a narrow view of the imperative, we might think that Jesus is commanding or demanding that this woman give him a drink. But in this context, rather, a request is being made. This would be a helpful point to bring up if you're teaching or preaching, just because the way this command can be heard might suggest that Jesus was being rude or inhospitable to somebody. But actually, some other translations try to capture the nuance of this imperative. You can see that in the text comparison. The ESV all the way down to the NKJV have give me a drink for their rendering of this imperative. But when you understand the nature of request in this context, you can understand why the NIV and the NLT translate this a little bit differently. The NIV poses it as a question, will you give me a drink? And the NLT supplies the word please give me a drink. And both of these make the nature of request more explicit than would be otherwise. And it's the same here in Luke chapter 11, verse 1, where the disciples say, Lord, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples. Now, if we were to go down here to the reverse interlinear, hover over the morph line here, we would see that this is an imperative. Now, clearly the disciples weren't in the place of commanding or demanding that Jesus do anything. Rather, this should be taken as an imperative of request by the disciples. And it's clear, especially in the social context, that the disciples recognize Jesus as an authority figure, as their rabbi. And so it's because of that context that this imperative has the force of request instead of command. And just one verse later, in Luke 11, verse 2, we see an imperative in the third person. Now, as we've seen before in other categories, the third person usually supplies words like let him or let her, let the one. Here we don't have those words supplied. What the translations are trying to bring across is that this imperative is neither fully a command, because in prayer we don't command God, and at the same time it's not just granting God permission to bring his kingdom. Instead, this imperative, in this context expressing request, is imploring God to establish his kingdom. Or it's appealing to God, pleading with him to establish his kingdom among us.